Have you ever looked at an old map, one of those sepia-tone charts from a century or two ago? Have you noticed how the borders in continents like Africa or Asia were drawn with such unnervingly straight lines? It's as if someone took a ruler and just carved up the land, without any regard for the mountains, rivers, or the millions of people who lived there. These lines weren't drawn by nature. They were drawn in distant, lavish rooms, by men who had likely never set foot on the soil they were dividing. This is the beginning of our story, the story of colonialism. Imagine this, a world where your home, your culture, your entire way of life is suddenly discovered by strangers. These strangers arrive on your shores with flags and weapons, claiming your land in the name of a distant king or queen. They build railroads not to connect your communities, but to extract your resources, your gold, your rubber, your diamonds. They see your forests not as sacred groves, but as timber. They see your people not as equals, but as labor. This was the stark reality for vast parts of the world. The gears of the colonial machine began to turn, powered by an insatiable hunger for wealth and power, and it reshaped the destiny of entire continents. Think of the Berlin Conference of 1884. No African leaders were invited. Instead, European powers gathered around a map and, like a grotesque board game, partitioned Africa among themselves. This single event set in motion decades of exploitation and conflict. Communities were split apart, ancient rivalries were inflamed, and new, artificial nations were born, yoking together people with nothing in common but a shared oppressor. The promise was always civilization, but the price was freedom. The world was being rewritten, and for millions, their chapter was being authored by someone else, in a language they didn't understand. But history is never a one-sided story. The human spirit, by its very nature, yearns for freedom. As the colonial grip tightened, the seeds of resistance began to sprout. At first, it was a quiet defiance, a whisper of rebellion in the dark. It was the refusal to forget one's own language, the secret passing down of ancestral stories, the preservation of traditions in the face of immense pressure to assimilate. These weren't just cultural acts, they were acts of survival, a way of saying, "We are still here. You have not erased us." Then, the whispers grew into voices. People began to flee, not just from physical chains, but from a system designed to suffocate their potential. Imagine the courage it took to escape into dense forests or across treacherous terrain, seeking refuge in a neighboring land that might be just as unfree. It was a desperate flight towards a hope they could barely see. This was the first kind of escape, a physical departure from the immediate grasp of the colonizer, a raw, primal run for one's life. But escape isn't always about running through the wilderness. A new form of escape began to emerge, one fueled by a different kind of hunger, the hunger for knowledge. The colonizers brought their books, their schools, their ideas, intending to create a class of administrators who could help run the empire. But they underestimated the power of an educated mind. People who learned to read didn't just read colonial propaganda. They read about revolution, about rights, about self-determination. They discovered that the ideas of liberty and justice the colonizers preached back home were universal. Schools became unintentional cradles of resistance. The very tools of the oppressor were being turned against them. People started to see that the most profound escape wasn't just leaving a piece of land, but liberating the mind from a colonial mindset. This was the birth of independence movements. It started with pamphlets printed in secret, with students debating in hushed tones, with workers organizing strikes. It was the realization that true freedom wasn't just about reclaiming land, but about reclaiming one's identity, one's history, and one's future. The fight was on, not just in the fields and forests, but in the classrooms and on the printed page. The struggle for independence was long and arduous, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Finally, one by one, nations began to break free. The old colonial flags were lowered, and new ones, vibrant with the colors of freedom and hope, were raised. The joy was immense, the celebrations were epic. For a moment, it felt like the story was over, like the escape was complete. But the legacy of colonialism is a stubborn shadow. The straight lines on the map remained. The economic systems designed for extraction were deeply entrenched. The psychological scars ran deep. Winning political independence was a monumental victory, but the journey to true liberation had just begun. A new, more complex chapter of escape was starting. After independence, many of the brightest minds, the scholars, the doctors, the engineers who had been educated and inspired to build their new nations found themselves facing a different kind of wall. They faced political instability, economies crippled by decades of exploitation, and a lack of opportunities. The promise of a new dawn was clouded by the difficult reality of building a nation from the ground up. And so, another wave of escape began. This one wasn't a flight through the forest, but a departure from an airport. An airplane taking off became a powerful, and often painful, symbol. It represented the migration of talent, what we now call the brain drain. Passports were stamped, goodbyes were said, and a generation of thinkers and builders left their homelands. They weren't necessarily fleeing oppression in the same way their parents had. They were chasing opportunity. They were escaping the limitations imposed by the post-colonial struggle. They traveled to the cities of their former colonizers, London, Paris, Lisbon, and two new global centers, like New York and Toronto. They carried with them not just their luggage, but the hopes and dreams of their families, and the complex inheritance of their history. This modern escape is a paradox. On one hand, it represents a personal success story, an individual overcoming barriers to achieve their potential on a global stage. It's the story of contributing to science, art, and technology in new homes. On the other hand, it represents a collective loss for the nations they left behind. Nations that desperately needed their skills and leadership. Think about it. The journey began with people being forcibly brought into a global system against their will. It evolved into a desperate flight for physical freedom. Then, it became a fight for political independence. And now, it's a complex migration for economic and professional opportunity. Each stage is a form of escape, a search for a place where one can truly be free and thrive. The story of colonialism and escape isn't just something in history books. It lives on in the skylines of our global cities, built with the labor and intellect of people from every corner of the earth. It lives on in the music we listen to, the food we eat, and the very fabric of our multicultural societies. It lives on in the stories of our own families, if we just take a moment to ask. It's a story of profound loss, but also of incredible resilience. It's a reminder that the lines drawn on a map can never truly contain the aspirations of the human heart. The quest for freedom, in all its forms, is a journey that continues, for individuals and for nations, even today. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through a complex and important part of our shared history. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the forces that have shaped our world. Your support means everything. See you next time.